So I'd like to welcome you all to this Shrewsbury Focus. As you know, the topic of this one is called Employment Rights in the New Normal. So new normal, post-COVID, all these strange working conditions that have been foisted upon our insecure workers and how we can help them and what's happened to their workers' rights. My name is Julia Buckley. I'm a councillor from Bridge North. I was also a Unison rep for 4 years until I gave up my job to be a full-time councillor, and I'm delighted to be taking over as leader of the Labour group here in Shropshire from the 1st of January. We've got an excellent panel here today with so much experience from all different parts of the Labour and trade union movement. We have got to my left Ash Silverson here, who's the Shropshire and Telford President of the Shropshire and Telford Trades Council. Councillor Gemma Offland, who's on her way, is also the Secretary of the Council. To my right, of course, we have Jack Dromey MP with an illustrious history in the trade union movement. But we're going to start with our first speaker, is Lee Barron. So I'm just going to give a small introduction. Lee was first appointed as the Regional Secretary for the Trade Union Congress in the Midlands in August 2014. So that's a group made up of over 50 organisations affiliating over 1 million working people. And Lee is its senior representative and spokesperson for the region. Lee was raised and still lives in Northampton and served the Postal and Telecom Workers Union, the CWU, at local level and then on to regional level for 26 years prior to his appointment to the TUC. So Lee will kick us off tonight with a few words, and we'll go around each of our speakers in turn, and then of course we'll throw the floor open to some questions and answers. So, over to you, Lee.
Lovely, thank you. Thank you, Julia. I'm tempted to start off by asking people where they've parked, but perhaps don't go down there at the minute. First of all, I think initiatives like this are brilliant. I think that doing this, getting people together, talking about our issues, our aims, our concerns and all that, I think are fantastic, in particular in areas like this. I think there's too much sometimes where we go to our safe kind of areas and kind of speak amongst ourselves and talk to ourselves, not do more that we can do in order to make sure that we can break out of that kind of stuff and get together in forums like this. So well done. I think it's a great initiative from the local Labour Party teaming up with the local Trades Council as well. So just a few sort of thoughts from me, because the thing I like more about these events is hearing from people. I think that basically, it's good to have an opportunity, to hear from people and what they're going through and what their thoughts are as we look to go forward. So, in terms of the pandemic, one of the things that will always stay with me was the way in which it shone a light on our key workers. The way in which it turned around and said, you know what, it's these people you depend on. Yet they were the very people that were in insecure work, on minimum rates of pay, 0 hours contracts, sometimes bogus self-employment. And what I think it did, you got those claps on a Thursday which will never pay the bills, but at the end of the day, I believed for us as a movement, one of the things that we needed to do was to somehow bottle that up, somehow try and grab that, and somehow start trying to organise around it. We needed to capture the moment, and what it also did was demonstrated the lack of rights that those people had, because during that pandemic we saw what was happening with personal protective equipment. We saw what people did, and the clue was in their name. They're care workers, and they were working around the clock in the absolute worst conditions possible and getting very little support. And we saw that as far as their statutory rights were concerned. Somebody went sick, they were expected to live on 92 quid a week. Even government ministers were standing there saying that they couldn't afford to live on that, yet did absolutely diddly squat, and still do diddly squat in order to change that. And they're the worst statutory sick rates in Europe. And what we had to do, I think, as a movement, rightly so, was to get ourselves in a position where we could bring something to the table in order to make sure that we could get through it. So we launched their campaigns around statutory sick pay, and we've released something today around seasonal workers, nearly 1 million of them getting no rights whatsoever in the run-up to the Christmas festive period, and putting some pressure again on government in order to make sure that we can do something about that. Also during the pandemic, we had the job retention scheme. How on earth we missed the trick about letting people know that furlough was written in the halls of Congress House. That's where it came from. We don't celebrate that enough, and the government take that as somehow credit for them in doing something that they did to protect the economy, where actually it came from this labour movement. And what we need to do in moving forward is to make sure that we can focus that on certain sectors that aren't going to recover as quick as others, because what they've done is chopped off furlough. And those sectors now which aren't recovering as quick, we could still have the potential for long-term unemployment and seeing skilled workers out of work. And one of the things that I'll always talk about when we talk about skilled workers and exactly what happens when there's no plan is I'll talk about Northfield, a constituency in Birmingham that used to hold the MG Rover plant that Jack will know about far more than what I will. But within a decade of that plant closing, it became the hotspot in the UK for the most amount of people paid below the real living wage. And that's incredible when you think about that plant when it was there and the skilled jobs that they had. And in effect, you had engineers delivering pizzas because nobody put a plan in place in order to make sure that those skilled workers could move on to other skilled work. So my view is coming out of the pandemic, what we need to do is to build a new deal for working people. Great slogan, what does it actually mean? And I think for me, it means something that's fairly basic. It means that work should be a route out of poverty and not a lifetime trap within it. 40% of people that claim benefit are in work. I find that a scourge on our economy. Not because I don't think people should get that money, I think that they should. The scourge is the fact that employers aren't paying that money. If I told you that the British taxpayer gives to McDonald's employees £200 million a year in order to make up their low pay rates, I think you'd turn around to me and say that that's outrageous. If McDonald's was a company, if McDonald's was a country, it'd be the 7th richest nation in the world, and we give £200 million of taxpayers' money to subsidise their low pay. That to me is fundamentally wrong. The world of work has got to deliver for working people, and work should always be the route out of poverty. We sell our labour. That's what we do when we go to work, and we expect a wage in order to live on and in order to support our families. So looking forward and then moving forward, I think that what's crucial, what's really important is that we somehow come up with a plan, and we somehow come up with something that puts the meat on the bones about building that new deal. And what I think, it's probably more of a personal view than, say, TUC policy. I think we need to change the narrative a bit. All too often, I think we kind of have these arguments about what happened 40 years ago. I'm not sure they're the right arguments now that we should be having. I think that we've moved on quite substantially since then, and I get people coming at me from all kinds of aspects of it. I had somebody 2 weeks ago genuinely said to me, the worst thing we ever did was create a minimum wage, because it means the unions aren't free to bargain, and it means that people are. And I was taken aback by that kind of view. And I think to myself that what we do need are basic rights where we always create a floor, but we always ensure that the unions are pushing at the ceiling to make sure that we can get the best for working people. So I do think that there needs to be a new set of ideals and principles that form something for the 21st century, that ain't arguing about 40 years ago, but are talking about now how we create something that's different, something that's sustainable, and something that delivers more for working people. And just 2 quick examples I'll give of that. First of all, sectorial collective bargaining, I think, is key and essential. If the care sector is going to recover from what it went through, if it's going to get the people in it to work within it, then we need to make sure that we're bargaining sectorially to lift the terms, the conditions, the pay for those people within it. So I think that we should be putting that forward to make sure that we can protect those people in those kind of jobs. And the second example I'll give is workplace access. All of these companies and all of these countries turn around to us and say, you have got the freedom of association. That means that you've got the freedom to join a trade union. What they then do, after they tell you that, is do everything they can to frustrate you actually exercising that freedom. by not letting trade unions in. We're the enemy at the gate. We're the ones standing outside giving out leaflets while the bosses say you ain't coming in here and we're not going to let you in, although you've got the freedom of association. I think the legal right of access should now be something that we call for and should now be an absolute key demand to us centrally in moving this forward. Because at the end of the day, what we've seen in the world of work during the pandemic, I do a bit in Leicester, where we've seen the sectors in Leicester going through worsening situations, and they were in lockdown pretty much permanently because they were forced to go into work because of the exploitation, whilst their employer was still claiming furlough payments and furlough fraud. You know, not allowing unions in places like that, I just think is fundamentally wrong. So just two really quick examples of how we can, if you like, start to move the debate on and start to create, if you like, a Bill of Rights that turn around and give trade unions a real say in the future. I think we've demonstrated what we can do as far as the job retention scheme is concerned. I think now we take that to the next level and to the next steps to make sure that we can create a world of work that actually delivers for working people.
Well done.
Thank you. That was really interesting, you know, understanding how relevant the trade union movement has become and how that relevance can project forward if we take this opportune moment to keep pushing that envelope. That was fascinating, and I know there'll be lots of questions as we come to the end. So I'd now like to introduce our next speaker to my right, and that's Jack Dromey. He's the MP, obviously, for Erdington in Birmingham. He rose to prominence during the Grunwick strike in the 1970s and went on to be elected to be the Deputy Secretary of the Transport and General Workers Union and then Deputy General Secretary of Unite. After being elected as the MP for Birmingham Erdington in 2010, you were appointed as the Shadow Housing Minister. In 2013, Jack was appointed Shadow Policing Minister, and since then you've served as Shadow Minister for Labour, Procurement Policy and the COVID-19 Public Inquiry, and you're currently the Shadow Paymaster General, so there's quite a lot of roles in there. You've had to go at pretty much everything, and we were delighted in 2019 in the general election when you were returned as the Member of Parliament for Birmingham Erdington, and you've been a champion for the area, campaigning for a fair deal for the city and also for the West Midlands Police Service. Quite a mouthful. I don't know how you're going to follow that, but I'm sure that you will. Delighted to have you.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. And can I start by saying who I am not? When my son Harry was 6 years old in 1989, with the Berlin Wall coming down and the collapse of the Soviet Union, he was a remarkable young boy who liked to watch the news before he went to bed. And of course he would watch the news, Soviet Union, Berlin Wall, and he used to ask me, "Dad, what do you do?" And I said, "I work for a trade union." "Oh," he said. And what the little bastard did was to get it mixed up in his mind. So there we were, out late on a Saturday. Normal babysitter couldn't stand in, so her friend did so. Came home, and the babysitter said, "Do you mind walking me home? It's rather dark." I said, "No, not at all, not at all." Walking up the street, said, "You're Harry." I said, "That's our Gaza. Remarkable young boy. You're Harry. I've never babysat anyone before who wanted to watch the news." I said, that's him. And then she looked at me through quizzical eyes and said, "Do you mind if I ask what you do?" And I said, "No, not at all. I work for a trade union." "A trade union?" Harry said, "You work for the Soviet Union." And I remember the following day having him over the table saying, "Harry, I'm chair of the nuclear unions, the defence unions, do not go into your school playground saying my dad works for the Soviet Union." I grew up in the era of great battles. So I was on the strike committee of the Trico strike, 21 weeks, great battle on equal pay, and we won. And then the epic battle at Grunwick. The biggest mobilisation in labour movement history in support of a local dispute. 20,000 workers there on one day alone, remarkably supporting overwhelmingly newly arrived Gujarati women from East Africa who were being treated shamefully. I fought, therefore, for working people all my life. And one of the things that I learned right at the start of my experience was that it was the era of Jack Jones coming to an end, that legendary General Secretary of the old Transport and General Workers Union. And Jack Jones at his valedictory said, "For working people, there is the twin access to power is in the world of work, their trade union card, and in the corridors of power is their right to vote and the Labour Party." And he was absolutely right. And the lessons, therefore, I and indeed I think all of us have learned over the years, fundamentally two things. First of all, that whilst I strongly believe in strong, no-nonsense trade unionism, hard-nosed, knows how to stand up to the governor, in particular when the governor is behaving badly, it's a style of trade unionism which is also about knowing how to engage and build coalitions, because it's crucial to some of the things that you said. And secondly, there's a simple and enduring truth that to be in a trade union is more likely to be better paid, more likely to enjoy a decent pension, less likely to be discriminated against or bullied, more likely to enjoy equal pay and treatment, and less likely to be sacked unfairly. So what was the lessons then of when I first became active in the trade union movement many years ago endure to this day. The relevance of trade unions in the modern world of work is every bit as strong as it was throughout our history. Having said that, we have problems in the trade union movement. We've been in decline for many years, albeit there are some encouraging signs in some sectors of trade unions reversing that tide. But having said that, against the background of a rapidly changing world of work, the growth of casual and insecure labour, the gig economy, it's become ever more difficult for trade unions to organise. And you were absolutely right, Lee, when you spoke about Rover. I mean, I was involved in the great battle to save Rover from closure. I don't mind admitting on the day that we finally lost that battle, Tony Woodley, the General Secretary, and myself as Deputy General Secretary, we were in tears because 5,000 workers lost their job on that day. And those were good jobs, well-organised jobs. Suddenly they were replaced by casual employment, and the consequences is exactly as you have described. So for me, the enduring lesson is strong trade unions are an absolute pillar of the rights of working people and a pillar of our democracy. Now, I learnt a lot of lessons over the years in terms of the battles that we fight, which are relevant to what Lee has described, how we fight and win some of the battles that confront us now. For example, I took the bill establishing a private members' bill, the Gangmasters Licensing Authority, through the House of Commons in 2003 to set up a body which has been highly successful, now extended to cover modern slavery, and that had at its heart, for certain, us as the T&G, strong, no-nonsense, taking on some of the worst bastards in the world of gangmasters. But what we also did was we built a coalition involving as well the supermarkets, the National Farmers Union, from plough to plate, as we called it, which was absolutely crucial to taking that bill through the House of Commons. And we learnt lessons from that in terms of coalition building, but also what we did was to remember constantly that any employer who thinks that they can get away with liberties will always take them on. And so, for example, in terms of you'll remember this, the Two Sisters dispute back in 2009, when 59 Kashmiri workers were sacked, and they were sacked for 9 weeks. We got them back. How did we do it? The very supermarkets that we worked with in coalition around establishing the Gangmasters Licensing Authority, we started picketing those supermarkets all over the country to put them on the spot, to say you can't pretend that you were reputable when you worked with us on the GLA, then to get your chicken from a company that treats workers absolutely shamefully. So it was those lessons of a strong no-nonsense, knowing how to engage, building coalitions, but being absolutely clear about what was and what was not acceptable. If I can then give another example, I was a founder member of the Drive for the Living Wage. When I became Deputy General Secretary, was elected back in 2003, my task was to set up the organising department of the union. We had 100 organisers, and to forgive the commercial, we were the best in the business. And right at the start, what we did was to team up with Telco, as it was called, East London citizens, to organise 4,000 cleaners in Canary Wharf and the City of London. You remember it, the great battles that we fought at the time, those freezing streets in November 2003. And what we then did was we linked up with the faiths, because that's what Telco was, the faiths. An organisation of community organisations, but also the different faiths, the Christian faith, the Muslim faith, the Jewish faith, all standing together in the cause of dignity and fair treatment of employees, the faiths. And that was very powerful indeed, because what it did was both to underline the moral authority of what we were doing, but what it also did was to give strength to the cleaners, because overwhelmingly the cleaners came from Latin America and South America, and they were overwhelmingly active churchgoers, and they saw therefore their union and their faiths on their side. And we made that major breakthrough in terms of establishing for the first time a living wage, and of course be built upon that subsequently over the years that have followed. So the reason I just paint that background of those two particular examples is that the industrial, the political, the community, the legislative, and sometimes even the cross-party work, all of those things we learn from experience in terms of the battles that we fight. Crucially, it's where we go from here, because we're facing big changes in the world of work, with the casualisation of work. Again, as Lee, I think, very ably indicated earlier on. And now the impact of COVID. Now, crucially, where do we go given that, and what are the lessons, and what are the battles that we fight next? We had our successes, and you're absolutely right, Lee. And I was involved actually personally in the discussions that set up the furlough scheme. The role of the TUC was absolutely outstanding, and the work that you did in particular, it was a major breakthrough because it saved tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of workers from losing their jobs. But if you then look at the other consequences of that awful period which we're still living through, first of all, on pay. I mean, the impact, for example, on public sector workers, it's nothing short of a scandal, that we're talking about either pay freezes or perhaps 3% increases for the people who put themselves on the line throughout that awful period, only to be rewarded with a cut in their living standards. And therefore, I'm 100% behind the battle of the trade unions and the TUC for fair pay that protects living standards. Secondly, on sick pay. Again, Lee was absolutely right. Never again should workers have to choose between putting themselves at risk on the one hand and on the other hand not being able to pay their bills. And therefore absolutely crucial going forward is that workers who are self-isolating should be entitled to full sick pay, and also the current statutory sick pay just is not good enough. Thirdly, fire and rehire, because what we saw during the pandemic was an increase in fire and rehire. 1 in 10 workers now affected, 3 million who have suffered as a consequence. And I've met with workers who have been victims of that. Absolutely shameful what happened, for example, in British Gas. This was a successful, profitable company, and people who'd worked for it for 5, 10, 15 and 20 years being told, in essence, either you accept or you're out. If you accept, you can come back, but on our terms. Absolutely scandalous. And that's why, again, 100% support for the campaign of the trade unions, but also what we've committed to in Parliament in terms of the abolition of what is an obnoxious measure. I've been personally involved in a whole number of initiatives around that, and it's a battle we are determined to fight and win. Fourth, 0 hours contracts. I mean, I remember going to the Rugeley depot of Amazon and actually getting into the depot, making Amazon an offer they couldn't refuse at the time, getting into the depot, then walking around the depot, talking to workers who, incidentally, before they talked to you, they wanted to go behind the pallets where they couldn't be seen by the governor. And to hear people who would look over both shoulders, then saying how awful it is not being able to plan what they're going to do next week or the week after. Many people directly employed, but many, many people in Amazon who were on 0 hours contracts. And trying to lead your life, to plan your future, to feed your family in circumstances where you never know from one week to the next what you're going to get, absolutely scandalous. Again, I'm determined that together with the trade unions, 0 hours contracts becomes history. Fifth, and an unusual one in terms of the experience of the COVID lockdown, and that is what the TUC are campaigning for, and this is this notion of switch off, because a hell of a lot of workers now work at home. The only problem is a lot of governors then say, well, if you're working at home, we want to contact you any time that suits us, and you can't plan your life on that basis. So on a whole number of fronts. Another one is in relation to assaults on shop workers and indeed public service workers. The consequences have been very serious for many. There have been soaring assaults on shop workers in particular. And again, we're 100% behind their campaign for tougher penalties against those who assault shop workers. So the reason I just paint the background in terms of past struggles is we learn from our history in terms of how we fight our battles. Now it's about how we go forward at the next stages, and in particular tackling the consequences of COVID in the way that Lee has indicated. If I can just say this then in conclusion, 2 points. The first is that Lee's absolutely right, that the great task now for the trade union and labour movement, standing together, is going forward that New Deal for workers. And I absolutely agree with what Lee has said in for example, this issue of sectoral bargaining. But if there's one other thing that we learn from our history, I learned from Jack Jones, and it is as relevant as it was then as it is today, that if we want to change the world in which we live, of course it's important to have strong and well-organised trade unions, but it's also crucial that we have that historic link of the Labour Party together with the trade union movement. The Labour Party is and remains the voice of working people. We have our ups and we have our downs, but of that there is no doubt. And so going forward, it is that New Deal for workers that says we ain't going to turn back the clock to some of the practices that should have been abolished years ago. What we are going to do is to fight for a different world in which the next generation are brought up, no longer in fear of shameful treatment by employers, and demanding instead, and absolutely rightly so, respect.
Thank you very much, Jack. I think that gives us all so much confidence to hear those stories of success and the strong partnership here we can hear through from parliamentary up to regional level, and we can hear these activities underway, this strategy and these plans for the future. I know it certainly gives me hope and a lot of confidence. Now we're going to move a step now onto the front line, and we're going to hear from some of our front line trade unionists who are working here in Shropshire and Telford, representing on a daily basis people who are experiencing these real life problems, and so it's really bringing it back to home for all of us. So I'd like to introduce now Gemma Louise Offland. She's been a Labour councillor for 5 years in Hadley and Leigh-Gomery, representing that ward over in Telford, and before that for 2 years on the borough, so quite a legacy there through the Labour Party on the ground. But also her role at work, starting in community care and then becoming a nurse, and then over at Shrewsbury College, and I imagine that might be one of your ex-tutors over there, following the trade union studies, a very well-known local course here, bringing forward lots of trade union activists, which has enabled Gemma to become, for 10 years now, the Secretary of the Shropshire and Telford Trades Council. We're delighted to have you, Gemma. If you'd like to tell us some tales from the front line, please.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody. So as you know, I'm a nurse, so we've probably gone through the biggest pandemic that I've known in probably my history, and all that National Health Service workers that have done during the pandemic and continue to do. However, there's this current trend at the moment with regards to National Health Service workers, and that is the increase in downbanding of staff, restructuring, rebanding, and then it's the constant you going in and you don't know what to expect every day, and you don't know how many numbers, if you're going to have enough staff between how many patients you've got, and I think this is getting continually worse. I don't think it's getting any better. You know, we've got 30 some odd vacancies across the country, 30 some odd thousand vacancies across the country, not 30,000 some odd vacancies across the whole of the NHS. This is obviously, we all need to have a work-life balance, and this obviously isn't happening. What we're tending to find is, you know, people who've got families, you know, 12.5-hour days, sometimes 14-hour days, depending on where you work, and that all depends if you get home after that 14 hours. Because for me, and as difficult as it is, you know, and I'll use, say for example, you know, Mary's on the toilet, would you actually go home and leave her on the toilet, and the risk that actually would she get back to her bed without falling? How could you, you know, so it's that extra, maybe half an hour on top, you know. If someone did have a fall on the way out, would you leave them there? No, you'd have to do your report and everything before you left. So it's this increase. And the difference between work-life balance with families, we're tending to find that a lot of people are doing bank work instead. With doing bank work, then they can pick their hours, but they're not getting the terms and conditions that we all get when we're contracted with sick pay, holiday pay. And then again, you've got that line between families are struggling with regards to poverty. So, and what we're tending to find is they're trying to go for the cheaper option instead of quality, so not investing. So for me, I was a lucky student nurse. My fees were paid for. There's a lot now that are coming in that are coming out with anything between £9,000 and £27,000 worth of debt before they even qualify. If they invested more in that, looking at our wages within regards to real terms, and you know, it's not about that for nurses at all, but it's about getting paid for the job that we actually do. So there's a massive increase in wages. We've got the whole concern with regards to the NHS bill that's just gone through, where we'll get dibs and dabs from private organisations coming in, and again will have an impact in driving down the jobs within the sector. So basically, with regards to the NHS, I believe that people should deserve a pay for the job and not live in poverty, as it's the 21st century. I've never actually had to go and use a food bank, but I know colleagues that have, and we shouldn't have to do that. I think that's from that point of view with regards to the NHS as a whole. What I will say is that a trade unionist, and I will always be the person, you know, we were having conversations the other day about the NHS ballot, and I'll say to anybody, get out on that picket line, fight for what's right, and I'll always be that one. If you're the only one that stands out there, you stand out there. But I think now's the time, and I'll say to all National Health Service colleagues, care staff, care workers out there, now's the time to stand up, and it's not only to stand up for yourselves, but to stand up for them patients, the customers, the service users within which you support, because I think it's important, because I think it's only going to get worse, you know. And do we want to go pre-1945 is what I got told the other day. No, we don't. We don't want to be back there where we can't, you know, walk into accident emergency and get something fixed. We don't want to actually see people dying on the doorstep because they can't afford the care that they so rightly deserve. So for me, I will always stand up. I'll always stand up and fight. Now's the time. Protect jobs. Stand up for what's right. United we stand and divided we shall fall. Thank you.
Thank you, Gemma. That was really interesting. I think we've all heard and we read in the papers about the NHS, but to understand the scale of the problem, I think it is quite humbling. And, you know, we can hear in you the feisty trade unionist who's out there fighting. But you know what I really heard in every sentence is how you care about those patients and that what you're fighting for is for their dignity. And I think that's really humbling. Thank you very much, Gemma. Okay, I'd like to introduce our final speaker for this evening, and that's Ash Silverstone, here to my left. Ash has been involved in the Shropshire Trade Union movement for the last 4.5 years. 3.5 of those as the chair, convener and assistant secretary, another mouthful, of the Shropshire Unison branch. But he's also, in the last 1.5 years, become the president of Shropshire and Telford Trades Council. So over to you, Ash Silverstone.
Thank you. I don't quite know why Julia left me till last, because there's no way that I can follow these three speakers. But when we think about employment in Shropshire, I looked at some of the headline figures. So 78% of those of working age in Shropshire in June this year were employed. Now that sounds great as a headline figure, but when you marry that with only 23% regionally, so across the Midlands, Lee might correct me, but only 23% of workers are unionised, it leads to quite a scary place, if I'm being honest. Like Gemma, I returned to the front line during the pandemic because there was absolutely no way that I as a trade unionist could sit back and watch my members go out and put their lives on the line and me not. When I had the skills, we needed those skills, it was the right thing to do. Trade unionists up and down the country all did exactly the same thing, because when we're in those workplaces, that's how we can keep them safe. One example, I went into a school after receiving 12 or 13 calls one morning talking about how unsafe the staff felt. So I liaised with colleagues from other unions and went into school, was stopped by a chief exec from the trust who said, "You're not coming in, absolutely no chance of you coming in. Anyway, what do you want to see? A cupboard full of PPE." And that just blew my mind. Absolutely not do I want to see a cupboard full of PPE. What I want to see is those staff in those classrooms that are putting themselves on the line, working with some of the most challenging children and young people in the county, have got the PPE and the protection that they need. That's what I want to see. I couldn't care less about having a cupboard full of PPE, if I'm being honest. And she followed on and said, "Oh, well, we spent £50,000 on PPE. Great. So you saying that the children that come to this school and that the staff that come to this school are just worth £50,000. Absolutely, it took a significant amount of investment from school funds. But keeping people safe had to be the primary focus at that point. And to me, it didn't feel that way. And I've had numerous conversations with various different organisations and members who are saying very similar things. What we're seeing, really and truly, is a race to the bottom, and it has to stop. Okay, the local government NJC pay ballot, I know for Unison that started on Wednesday this week. I know the health ballot is likely to not be that far behind. And that's about not only the pay rise that these public sector workers deserve, right up and down the country after the last 18, 19 months and everything that they've put on the line. They absolutely need and deserve that pay rise in recognition of that. But also when we look at the inflation rates, they're currently sitting at 3.5%. We know that potentially next year that's going to rise to 5%. We're seeing workers who are going to fill their cars up, they have to have a car for work, they have to be able to travel, and they're being battered at the pumps, absolutely battered at the pumps in terms of the cost of fuel. So some of the main areas that I'm really seeing coming through from my members and when talking to other unions as part of the Trades Council, mandatory vaccination. particularly in social care, is an absolute scandal. Absolutely, we need to be protecting the most vulnerable people in society, but it definitely needs to be by consent. Mandating it in a sector where we've already got massive amounts of vacancies is just going to lead to a situation where the care that is provided to those most vulnerable people is absolutely compromised, because there just aren't going to be the people there, because they've made that decision that they don't wish to have a vaccine at this point. Redundancies, I'm seeing a massive increase in what's called Section 188 notices. So that's a notice that employers send to unions to say people are at risk of redundancy. We are seeing an exponential increase in that of late, which is again scary. Those people that are working from home, I have conversations daily with people who still, after 19 months, are perched on the end of their bed. They're sat on dining room tables, sat on dining room chairs, all because they've been told that they need to work from home, but because they haven't got space for office equipment, or their employer isn't providing office equipment, they're having to compromise. And that eventually is going to lead to a situation where we're going to have significant health and safety issues, significant issues of people looking at being retired early, so in terms of ill health retirement, because of the working conditions that they're in. And it's absolutely scandalous that that's still going on. We're seeing an increase in insecure work as well. But one of the biggest things that I'm seeing when I'm going out representing members is shocking employment practices across the public and private sector. Absolutely shocking. So I recently represented a member, and I walked in, and having met with a member previously, the employer didn't even send them an investigation report, and this person was at risk of losing their job. So we had to step in and say, hang on a minute, you've got to give us this. They refused to give us any of the details of any of the complaints, etc. But when you looked at the investigation report, it was absolutely laughable. There was nothing in there. It had clearly been done on a hoof because the person's face didn't fit. And the company decided, no, we don't want you to continue to be here, because this person had stood up and said, I'm not happy with what's going on. I'm not happy with the environment that I'm working in. Staying with the care sector, what we're seeing increasingly is these private care providers that are being bought out by like investment firms, hedge funds, etc. And they're operating at around 40% profit. 40% of the money that local authorities are paying for these services is going straight into the back pockets of multimillionaires. And that's scandalous when you've got workers working for the minimum wage in absolutely shocking conditions, with really poor terms and conditions to boot. So, yeah, as Lee said, as Jack said, fire and rehire is a real big issue, and that's something that I think we're going to see more of, unfortunately, until it is outlawed. It's going to happen. I think everybody that's involved is so committed that it's going to happen. But what we have to remember as trade unionists and as people who associate with the Labour Party is, ultimately, on Judgment Day, we're going to be on the right side of history, because we're standing up, we're taking the fight back to these really poor employers, and we're making sure that people have got the skills, the conditions, and the pay that they really deserve. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ash. I think that's definitely why we asked you to go last. So you can bring forward all these really useful examples of the reality behind some of these patterns and trends that we've seen. So the outsourcing and privatisation, the casualisation, and then all of those consequences that flow from that, whether it's health, financial insecurity, that fragility, it's all underpinned, isn't it, from that lack of organised, structured, paid employment from direct employers, and the whole thing just unravels. So I think we've heard really the whole spectrum, haven't we? Right from Parliament, right through the Congress, right onto the shop floor, and then those different examples through employers.